A big thank you to all of the staff here who've made the festival possible, all of you who are here in attendance, the speakers. You are all the reason why I am here today, and especially to Christian, who I know as Christian in the United States, not Christy. It took me a few days to actually figure out who Christy was. But a big thank you to you, and it is so nice to be here after 13 years and to see that everything you've done here. So I've been telling stories for a little over a decade, and I became a journalist and a storyteller for the same reasons as a lot of the other speakers here today, probably for the same reasons that a lot of you also are interested in telling stories, or why you are telling stories. And that's because I believe in their power to change lives. When I was in journalism school, I would eagerly tell my friends that I was so eager to give a voice to the voiceless. I kind of go like this when I say that, because I don't say that anymore, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. But as we know, there is the saying, what bleeds leads. And I found this to be true both in my university newsroom and also at the first newspaper I worked at. I knew from the beginning, though, even still when I was in journalism school, that I wanted to tell stories of the light and the dark. And if I had to tell bloody stories, I wanted them to be not focused on the blood left on the ground by those who died, but by the blood pumping through the veins of the survivors, the blood that was keeping them alive, that was keeping them going, despite all the difficulty. So I told stories of people like Alejandro Núñez del Arco, who, despite being incarcerated at San Juan de Lurigancho prison, known to be one of the most dangerous prisons in the world, tried to set a world record for the most number of inmates, or anyone actually for that matter, practicing a sport called full body in the world. So he had been an aerobics teacher before he was arrested and sentenced to prison. And while he was there, he started practicing the sport again. At the beginning, he got a lot of ridicule. People called him gay, told him, "Why are you wasting your time? You're a sissy," just about every insult you can imagine. A few friends started practicing the sport with him and said, "Hey, it's not so bad. It's kind of fun." Then a few more and a few more, until this day when they set the world record inside of the prison. In Zimbabwe, I met Pammy, who was repeating the same grade the third time in a row. Because of climate change and drought, her family wasn't able to harvest anything, and the harvest was what they used for their income and also to eat. Pammy was eating about one meal, she was eating one meal a day when I visited her, and her family couldn't pay for her school fees. In Zimbabwe, at her school, if you don't pay for the school fees, you can't advance to the next grade. So even though she was going back to the same class, learning the same things, she kept going, and she had a dream of one day becoming a police officer. I went to Nepal a month after the earthquake, and I met Anju and Vishnu on the morning of their wedding. They both lost their homes in the earthquake, and Vishnu's friends told them it wasn't a time to get married. On top of that, Anju's family had actually promised her to another man. But the two of them decided that their love was stronger than all the objections to it, and so that day they got married. A few weeks later, there was an aftershock, and Vishnu recalls the moment. I'll read his words. "Anju was holding my hand tightly. I kissed her on the forehead, then she fell asleep again. It gave me the thought that nothing can harm you if someone is there loving you, caring for you." This is why I tell stories. These people and their stories inspire me and give me a reason to keep going. After 4 years of living in Lima, Peru, I moved to Istanbul, Turkey. There are about 3 million Syrian refugees living in Turkey right now, and it wasn't hard to find stories about them in the media. The stories often detailed very well the tragedy they had been through in Syria and all that they had fled. But they didn't talk much about the future at the time, and often left them portrayed as victims with little agency and choice over what happened next in their life. I found something very different around me on the streets in my personal life. I met one Syrian man who owned a falafel shop that he had started in the neighborhood. It was becoming popular among foreigners and locals alike. It even had good ratings on TripAdvisor. There was another teenage boy I met, and he had learned Turkish in 3 months and was speaking at a native level. And then there were the artists and animators who were taking their pain and grief over the family members and the homes that they had lost and putting it into animation and art. And their films were being shown at festivals in Europe. But telling stories about Syrians was also tricky, because when I went to look and ask if I could tell these people's stories, I got rejected a lot. My friend at the falafel shop, his family was still in Syria. And he told me if he said the wrong thing, he was worried that he could upset the opposition or the regime, and it could harm his family. So maybe it was best to not tell his story. Someone else hesitantly accepted, but asked if I didn't show her face. And then there was another man who talked to me for about 10 minutes without letting me jump in to tell me about all the journalists in Istanbul who were there to get ahead in their careers and objectify the Syrian people, that they were being used for nothing more than another story, another award, and another paycheck. After this conversation, I actually went home and wondered if this man was right. And that day, I believe it was that day, I downloaded some practice exams for the Foreign Service and thought about changing my career. I searched online at humanitarian organizations. I thought about becoming an English teacher. I thought about making coffee and being a barista for a little while. And then I went to bed. Just when I was about ready to give up on telling stories about Syrians, I went to a friend's Orthodox Easter party. And I went there not looking for stories, but to eat her really good lamb. And I met a guy named Ziad. And that day, I don't remember that much about him except that he had an awful lot of hair gel. We didn't talk long, but long enough to become Facebook friends. And a few weeks later, I said, okay, I'm not quite ready to give up. I'm going to email Ziad. I'm going to just have a conversation with him about what stories I can tell and how I can contribute. So when I messaged him, he responded actually pretty quickly, and he responded to tell me that he had decided to travel to Europe. The next day, we met for tea, and I asked, can I follow you to Europe? He said yes, without any hesitation. And the journey began. This is Ziad here in the picture. Ziad studied at the University of Damascus in Syria, English literature. And in Syria, if you're studying at the university, you're exempt from joining the army. Ziad had decided he didn't want to fight, and so he delayed his university time. He took a class here one semester, a class there. He would put off taking the exam so he would still have status as a student. The minute he graduated, he would be expected to join the army. And there were checkpoints popping up all over Damascus at the time, asking young men in particular for their documents. Ziad was starting to feel the heat and he felt he couldn't delay his university anymore. He had completed all his coursework and just had one exam left to take. So when he had the opportunity to move to Turkey, he did. When he left to Turkey, he did so to avoid, I'm going to use his words here, fighting, holding a gun, and shooting my own people. Ziad learned English as much from the characters and friends as he did from his classes at the University of Damascus. And this luckily landed him a job at a hotel in Istanbul. He started off as a housekeeper and earned about €200 a month, and after a few months, acquired more responsibilities. In fact, he was actually running the hotel for the two managers who would often just sit out front and eat breakfast, while he managed the reception, cleaned the rooms, got clients tea, answered questions, and answered the phones. His salary went up by about €50 for all these additional responsibilities. He was waking up at 6 a.m. and often going to bed at midnight or 1 in the morning. And after about 1.5 years of this rhythm of work, a good friend of his from his village back in Syria came to visit. His friend had moved to Norway the year before, going through Bulgaria on a smuggling route. And he sat across the table from his friend, and his friend told Ziad, "We're earning the same amount of money, but I'm studying a language, and I'm going to go back to university, and I have free time. You should come to Norway." Ziad couldn't help but agree, and so he started saving. He worked more. He took additional jobs on top of his already more than full-time job. When he had about 2,000 euros saved, it was robbed out of his room at the hotel where he lived. And he worked again and again, more and more and more, until he earned that 2,000 back, another 1,000. And when he had 3,000 euros, it was enough to contract the smuggler and start the journey to Norway. I decided and made the decision not to take the boat with Ziad for safety reasons and also financial reasons. As a new freelancer in Istanbul, I wasn't generating a lot of income at the time. And just to take the boat from the shores of Turkey to a Greek island was about 1,500 euro. Instead, I would wait for a WhatsApp location from Ziad that would hopefully be from a Greek island. So in Istanbul, I had my phone close and was anxiously awaiting his message. In the meanwhile, Ziad was with others in a coastal town of Turkey, and with about 50 people. The smugglers needed to get them to the shores that were starting to be patrolled more and more. So they put them into a truck so their presence wouldn't be detected as they moved from the city to the point where the boat would leave. Here's Ziad.
So we went inside and it was so crowded. Like, you cannot move. If you sit, it will be hard for you to stand again. If you stand, you cannot sit. So you will just stay in the same position for 3 or 4 hours. First, in the first hour, he was driving on a normal way. But then he started going to the mountain. And the car was shaking. He kept driving so fast, so crazy. So after that, people start to faint. They start to lose conscience. We kept knocking on the doors, on the roof, telling him to stop. Okay, we don't want to leave anymore. Then he stopped the car for 2 minutes to take a breath, and he closed the door again. And we told him that, okay, keep the door open. There is no place to breathe. He said, no, I cannot leave the door open. After like 30 minutes to 1 hour, we start feeling something burning. People start coughing, and we were worried about the kids. In the truck, it was totally dark. We don't see each other. We start knocking on the doors again, and on the roof, on the walls, telling him to stop. Yeah, finally he stopped back, and it was really burning. The wheels were burning. We smelled plastic. So we opened the doors and we went out. He said, okay, but if the police catch you, you have to come. We told him, okay, we don't care anymore. We don't want to go further.
So very early into the trip, most of these people were already ready to give up. They were still in Turkey. Fortunately, they got out of the truck and waited in the woods for a few hours, and the police never came. The next morning, they boarded the boat you see in the picture here, and after a little more than 3 hours at sea, they arrived on the Greek island of Chios. I bought a ticket for a passenger ferry, and in 30 minutes, I was on the same island. When I spotted Ziad among the hundreds of other refugees, I ran to him and gave him a big hug. He told me a lighter version of what had happened with the truck, and then introduced me to some of the people he had begun traveling with. Hashim, on the upper left here, drove the boat from Turkey to Greece. He had never driven a boat before that day, but he didn't have the money to pay for the trip across the sea, and the smugglers told anyone who could drive the boat that they would get a free passage. So Hashim didn't pay the 1,500 euro that everyone else paid. Below Hashim is Ahmad. Ahmad is a philosophical guy. He often had a book with him. He loves to read. Next to him is Asa, who was very young, smart, and she needed new shoes because she only had flip-flops. And I'm not an Arabic speaker, but the guys told me Asa also really liked to curse. Above there in the top upper right is Abdul Rahman, who miraculously always had perfect hair and did what he could to make sure everyone else on the trip also had good hair. In his small backpack, he had hair gel. And below him is Saif. Saif was super intimidating, like a bouncer outside of a club. He had his hair in a goatee that he would braid and pin in a bobby pin. And the first few days, I was actually a little bit afraid to point my camera at him. In the top middle is Manhal. And Manhal was a jokester. He loved to sing, especially on long bus rides.
رحت رميها على الرصيف والمنظر برضه كان ظريف شفت شلة بنات عجباني وخلاص يلا.
Later that day, we arrived at the Greek-Macedonian border. There were that day an estimate of about 5,000 people waiting to cross, and the police were letting people cross in groups of 50. After doing the math, it was pretty obvious we weren't going to cross the border that day. And so we opted to go back to a gas station a few kilometers away. There at the gas station, there was light and at least some bathrooms that we could use. That night, we looked for a spot in the corner of the parking lot to sleep on the concrete. And Ziad was so excited about how great it was. He was looking up at the sky and admiring the stars, reminiscing about his village back in Syria. Saif gave me his coat to sleep on, and we tried to close our eyes for a few hours. 2 hours later, we were woken as people were gathering their things quickly, and rumor had it the border was open. People were fighting over taxis, and some started to walk. When we arrived at the border, it had caught fire, and the field where the thousands of people had been waiting earlier was up in flames, and the air was filled with smoke. I looked off to my left, and I saw a woman holding a tiny, tiny baby, and she had a mask covering its mouth to keep it from inhaling the smoke. I started to cry, and it was Saif, the intimidating bouncer, who looked at me and noticed and said, "Elie, don't cry. It's like this every day in Syria. No problem. We continue. We're going to keep going. Yalla." And so we went. We pushed our way into the crowd, into the smoke. And me, who had decided to cross the borders legally and with my passport, turned back after getting a few shots, and a few kilometers away crossed the official border with my passport. It took a few minutes, and there was a warm welcome to Macedonia for me. It was not the same for the others who spent the whole night in the crowd, in the smoke, pushing their way through. The next morning, we reunited, and I saw bruises on some of their legs. When I asked where the bruises came from, they said they were from the police officers who were trying to control the crowd. As we waited for our bus to Belgrade, Ziad fell asleep, and Hashim smoked cigarettes. We made it to Belgrade, and after a good night's sleep, were eager to get to Hungary. There was a lot of rumors that the border with Hungary was going to close soon, and they wanted to get there really fast. As they were buying some things, food and other things, to prepare for the journey, a taxi driver charged Saif €75 for a trip that was a few kilometers that would normally cost €5. That night, at the Hungarian border, Ziad admitted to being afraid for the first time. I said goodbye to them and again went back to the border crossing that was official to wait in Hungary for them. That night, they were out all night in the cold, walking for more than 8 hours, and were then transported to Budapest under blankets in the back of a car, because in Hungary it was illegal for anyone, a taxi or anyone driving a car, to carry a refugee. We celebrated our arrival, or our reunion, in Budapest at the KFC with some good fried chicken. And just as we were starting to relax, the police cornered Hashim and dozens of other refugees in the ticket office and were holding them without any explanation. 1 hour passed, 2 hours passed, and we didn't know whether we should leave without him, wait for him. Just as the train was going to leave, they let them go, and we boarded the train for Vienna. Getting off the train in Vienna, there was a sense of relief. Outside, there were volunteers everywhere, handing people clothes, offering everyone warm drinks, helping people. Where do you want to go? Germany? Okay, you take this train. I could just see the guys relax, and that night we stayed with a friend of one of theirs in an apartment. We drank, we danced, we sang, and for a little while it felt like everyone could just kind of forget about what's next and getting to the next country. The next morning, I saw pride and dignity as the guys blow-dried their hair. Yes, blow-dried their hair, some of them, and ironed their jeans, their shirts, got ready for a walk around town. They posed for pictures in front of old statues and pretty buildings as they waited for the trains that would take them to their next destinations. And Manhal was really impressed with how clean the streets were in Vienna. Along the way, Ziad and the others rarely complained. From the beginning, they had decided to think of the journey as an adventure. They imagined they were just 20-somethings backpacking through Europe like anyone else. And I think I mentioned this before, but I often would forget the gravity of the situation for them. I enjoyed getting to know them so much and hearing about their days at university, their mother's cooking, their first loves. And it wasn't the few things in their backpack that they had decided to bring that made the journey better for me or for them. It was their mindset. The love, generosity, and resilience of these people on the move was overwhelming to me. Having lost everything or almost everything and seeing death far too often gave them a sense of meaning and a sharpened focus about the things that really mattered in life. And they accepted me, not just the group, but even the others outside the group that sometimes I would point my camera at, again and again. They believed in the power of their own stories. Two weeks from the day Ziad left Turkey, he arrived in Oslo, and I filmed as he stepped off the train. After one last interview, I hugged him goodbye the next day and told him that my life would never be the same. He thanked me for telling his story, and I took a train to the airport where I got on a plane and flew back to Istanbul. The flight was a little less than 4 hours and had cost me €100. To arrive to Norway had taken Ziad 2 weeks and cost him around €2,600. Back in Istanbul, something in me had shifted, and I felt a really deep sense of gratitude for little things. A few minutes on the phone with my dad, a home-cooked meal, a hot shower. I started accepting assignments in places I ordinarily wouldn't have. I had kind of an invincible feeling, and I found myself moving closer to some people and actually backing away from other relationships that had once meant so much to me. Meanwhile, a journalist and I worked on editing Ziad's story into an 11-minute video. But we couldn't find anyone that was actually interested in paying money for it. And I'm going to share with you a few of the responses that editors gave us. You can read them here, but the first one was to summarize. Someone who was quite interested in the story, thought it was great, but unfortunately had no money to pay for it. So if we could send them a link, they'd be happy to share it, but no money. Another one said cryptically, I have some bad news. Yesterday it was announced that blank is being acquired by blank. In the process, the video unit is being eliminated, so we won't be accepting any more video pitches ever. A little commentary on the state of the industry. Another editor called Ziad's experience, I quote, a lucky experience, relatively speaking. Maybe too lucky. Another said, I'm sorry for the delay, and unfortunately the final answer is no. It's just not ahead of the curve enough, although I tried to make the argument I lost. Also, after Paris, it needs an update. Then there was the NGO who suggested I pitch the story to the media outlets, and the media outlets who said perhaps I should pitch it to NGOs. Finally, I got this message. Just watched it, and I have a few thoughts. It's a really good story, but I think it needs some restructuring and some hand-holding. Could you guys send me a script, and let's schedule a Skype chat later this week? Yay! I thought perhaps I was going to get this story out there. But after just a few minutes on the phone, it quickly turned into a conversation about what's the next story I could tell for this client, instead of how could we make this story better, and in the editor's words, worth publishing. This was the first story, larger story, that I had spent a somewhat significant amount of money to me at the time, being in Istanbul as a new freelancer and really not generating income, that I self-published and was not picked up by an outlet. In the end, we decided to self-publish the story, and it was picked up by The Atlantic and shared as an editor's pick, and by The Ground Truth. But even though I wasn't paid for this story, the story got out there, and it's the story that has most impacted my life. I don't believe storytellers are paid in money alone. I believe we receive in deeper, more subtle, and much more valuable ways. On the journey, Ziad and I became close. After the story published, we stayed in touch, and he sent me pictures of some cute kids at an Eid celebration, and a picture he took hiking in the Norwegian mountains. I sent him a picture of a statue in Dubai made by a Syrian artist that made me think of him, and of some kids playing in a village in Afghanistan, because when I was in the village, it looked and felt so much like the village he described to me as where he grew up. About 5 months after the story published, I went back to see Ziad in Norway. And this is a picture here of a Syrian dinner that he and other Syrian refugees in Norway cooked for about 100 people in their small town. It was on this trip that Ziad and I first told each other, I love you. And most days, we still tell each other, I love you. I've experienced life with Ziad over the last 2 years, sometimes in person, like when I was lucky enough to spend the last 2 birthdays with him, and more often over screens, WhatsApp chat, Skype, whatever connection works. I remember the day he called me on WhatsApp, and I was able to get video while I was fumbling with my headphones on the street, walking home. He told me he had big news, and it was actually exactly 1 year from the day he arrived in Norway. He called to tell me that he had residency in Norway, and with this residency, he would be able to work and start building toward the life that he wanted. Now Ziad has a full-time job. He speaks Norwegian, and he plans to study social work next year at university. Last year, he was also named the Resident of the Year in his small Norwegian town in recognition of volunteer work that he's done to connect refugees in the local community, helping them to break stereotypes, work together, and make the community a safer, better, and more inclusive place. After the journey, I quit taking those practice foreign service exams and dreaming about other jobs, and I continued to tell stories of refugees in Turkey and throughout Europe. I am always thinking about new and different ways to use stories for impact, because journalism is changing. But I absolutely believe that stories are valuable and that they have the power to change lives for the better. I'm an example of that. Stories have changed my life for the better. And when I look back, I realize that my work has been as much about changing myself as it has others, about breaking my own stereotypes, filling in my own gaps, and facing everything that actually makes me very uncomfortable, including standing here and talking to you all. But I'm not standing here because the story of Ziad is an award-winning story or because it was the best story done about the refugee crisis. I'm only standing here because I was brave enough to listen to his story, share it, and let it impact my own. I no longer believe stories are, as I mentioned before, a way to give voice to the voiceless. What we do as storytellers is we listen, because everyone already has a voice. And with that said, I want you to all meet Ziad and ask him a few questions about why he decided to share his story with me and with all of you. Ziad? Hey there.
Hey.
How are you doing?
I'm good.
It's nice to be traveling this way with you, as opposed to the way.
Thank you so much. I'll say the same.
So, Ziad, why did you accept to have your story told at such a vulnerable and what you could call difficult time in your life?
I remember when you asked me first that you want to document the journey. You asked it in a very sweet way, and you made it sound so easy. Like you told me that I will not notice you or your camera, you will just like be filming and ask me questions on the road. So I said, yes, why not? On the other hand, like every one of us wants to be seen and like to be listened to. So I found it like a chance to be there.
How did me being there affect the journey?
Well, it had both positive and negative experiences. I would say, for example, the positive side, I felt secure next to you and with the camera. That, like sometimes when we like at some moment, like the police, like, well, let's go, or people will treat us a bit differently with the camera following us. So that was so helpful. On the other hand, like the negative part, I would say, like I felt so scared for you at some points. Like at that day in Greece, where we're looking for you everywhere, but we didn't find you. We thought like something bad happened to you, so we felt kind of responsible for you.
At one point, I ditched them to go charge my cell phone for a few hours, and I didn't tell them where I was going. I'm sorry for that.
You. That's okay. I forgive you for that.
And it's the worry I've most ever seen Ziad. Yeah. So was there any other things that you wanted to add about how me being there affected the journey?
Well, we felt like during the journey, like for me especially, like talking to you like all the way, sharing my like experience, like either from the past or like with what's going on right now, like at this very dangerous trip of my life. It felt good, like to be there with someone like who cares and be like following you and like asking you questions all the time, like how do you feel, how are you, where are you going next, like tell me about you, who you are, like the whole way. I felt so good that someone cares. You were not asking questions just like for the camera. You haven't like you asked many questions like behind the camera. Like so, I felt like you really care. Yeah. as a person, not as like, a journalist and a professional.
I did care, I still do. So you're right. Did you ever wish I hadn't been there?
Actually, yes.
What?
At some points, like as I mentioned before, like the moments where we feel like responsible, and like when we lost you that day, we're afraid like something bad would happen to you. Yes, at some like I felt like be like more dangerous for you because like we felt like we had to come here, but you chose to.
So I did a lot of interviews with you along the way, and I remember thinking really early on that you had trouble talking about the difficulties. So when I would ask you something about racism or prejudice or the things you saw in Syria, the way people treated you in Turkey that might have been negative, you would kind of steer it away to a positive thing or kind of avoid the question. And so I'm wondering if you felt you had difficulty talking about the difficulties, or how do you remember it?
Well, I remember like all what I needed at that time is like the energy to move forward. So thinking about all of those like negative things that I went through, they're not going to help me right now. Like all what I need is like to move forward and like see only like the positive things and like think of what's next, not what happened before.
Yeah, I felt that. Yeah.
I would ask you a question here, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Sure.
Well, you mentioned like I have been positive most of the way. Have you ever thought of like at any time of the journey that this guy is so positive, like it's worthless. I want to come back and give up. Did you think that?
No, I never wanted to give up on you on the journey. But as a journalist, I planned to tell your story, but I had my eyes and ears open to stories around me. And there were other things I would ask you about. Tell me about this person, and what did you hear about this person? Of course, since you speak Arabic, you always had a better sense of the situation than me. So I was always like keeping my mind open to that. But at the end of the day, you being so positive, yeah, I was frustrated sometimes because even when you like to find the light in the dark, like you need the dark, right? Showing the light in the light maybe isn't as interesting, or that's what I was thinking. So sometimes I would feel frustrated, but at the end of the day, I just kept reminding myself, like, look, this is your story, and it's not about what I want you to tell me, right? Going back to a lot of the things we've heard here about projecting, and so I would ultimately, to answer your question, I'm going off on a tangent, but no.
That's good. Because I remember like the first time I arrived to Greece, I met a journalist from Canada, and she was asking me like, how did it go, how it was? So I said, yeah, we made it, like we took the boat, we were lucky that it was sunny and it was quiet, so it took us like just 3 hours. So when I think and compare to other stories, like people who had, like, they lost their life in the ocean. But no, I consider myself lucky that I made it. So she keeps like asking me about like, yeah, tell me something like bad, something terrible happened to you. Mm. I don't want to think of that. Like it's not what I need right now. So it's good that you did it.
Is there something I could have done to make you more open or more comfortable talking about difficult things?
Well, I remember that you have been so sweet. Like you don't dig so deep. And I think you should have. Would have been like I would have like shared more, probably. Yeah.
I agree with the criticism because I remember being very afraid of upsetting you, and I knew it was such a delicate time. And I do remember many times wanting to ask questions, and then like my palms are sweating. Like, do I ask him? Will it upset him? What will happen if he gets mad at me? I'm just out here alone with a camera. Yeah, so I agree that I could have done a better job and been more patient and maybe not been afraid to ask some of the questions I had. So.
You did amazing.
I don't know. So what is it like being a Syrian refugee in Europe today?
Well, I would talk from my own perspective because there are thousands of refugees. When I left Syria and firstly I moved to Turkey, so I thought now I can breathe, take a breath and be relieved. But no, I had to go through other challenges. That I had to defend myself all the time, and more when I came to Europe. You see all the media talking about refugees, mostly negative, not positive. All what you hear about is, oh, there are a massive number of refugees. They are taking all over the place, and this doesn't feel good. This is not why I came here, and this is not who I am. It doesn't feel so good to be seen this way, and to feel that you have this defend yourself the whole time and show who you really are. It can be tiring sometimes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You told me once something. I'll repeat because I think it's interesting that you were so tired of being talked about and not talked to.
Exactly, and this is what I needed. In the journey, you were asking, so I felt oh, someone's listening to me, and this is what I need. I don't want to to wake up in the morning and when you open Facebook or you see TV, it's all negative. This doesn't make you feel good. So I want people more than to talk about refugees, just to talk to them, because we are all humans.
How did sharing your story in this way, having this 11-minute video out there in the universe, impact you in your life?
A lot. Firstly, I fell in love, and I'm sitting here with you. I'm so grateful for that. Secondly, I felt that I have an identity. When someone asks me, who are you, how did you come here? So, if I'm invited to a dinner with some friends, so I can just go online and show the video. Attending conferences in Norway or in the local community where I share the story and show the video, so people will come and ask questions. So it somehow brought me closer to people, and more than that, it brought us together.
So can I ask you why you fell in love with me?
Yes, you can.
Oh my God, wait. Maybe I should hit rewind.
Oh, why not? I'm very sweet, smart, beautiful, and
Oh!
You care, through the journey, have been with me the whole time. You are the most person that I shared my feelings with. So going this through hard time and being so vulnerable and sharing all emotions and being so close to you, this brought me even closer to you, and with keeping contact and brought us even closer.
Yeah, I would say going through the journey with you too, I felt very close to you after it. And when I left Norway and went back to Istanbul, that feeling I was talking about in the speech, the invincibility, I'll go to Afghanistan, everything's beautiful, talking to my dad's amazing. That was love, I was in love, but I didn't know it. And I thought it would go away. It was I was high, I did this, I took this risk, I took this journey, oh, come on, I don't love this guy. We just shared this intense experience. Of course I feel close to him, but then 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. I remember Googling how long infatuation lasts. And it's around 5 months or something. So if you're still thinking about someone after 5 months, make a move. So yeah, that I feel the same way. I definitely share your feelings. And it was love.
It is.
Yeah. So would you encourage others to share their stories?
I would definitely do.
Why?
I don't promise everyone like to fall in love after telling this story.
And I don't encourage all journalists to fall in love with people they tell stories about either. No, like sharing my story, it brought me closer to people and like to see the reaction that it make like in your life and in others. Like I remember the last time I shared my story, it was like 5 days ago. Someone came and told me, "Thank you so much. Like, this is what I needed to hear today." This felt like so good. It gives me like energy to like share more and be open, and also it gives me like self-confidence. Like this is who I am. So I do encourage people. Do you ever get sick of me asking so many questions?
And saying that, I'll say no comment. And do you have any more questions?
I think we're done.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone, for giving me the chance to be here.
Thank you. Bad, that's it. You have to go to this side.